I had an overview of what was going on, but it was Kwasi Kwarteng who was doing all the detailed work.
You're not very good at wooing people. In fact, you do the opposite.
This is not a dating show.
It's not a dating bit, but you don't have to sack the head of the Treasury the moment you come in. Welcome to The Rest is Money with me, Robert Peston. Steph McGovern still away on her mystery project. Liz Truss still with me, and so much still to ask you, Liz. Now, I want to go on to some broader questions in a minute. I've got two more points I want to put to you here. One is I just want to observe that when you say, governments are not responsible for inflation, I mean, obviously they can contribute to inflation, with some of the things they do, but you are rather undermining the current Prime Minister's claim that the halving of inflation is all down to him.
Well, I believe inflation is a monetary phenomenon, and the Bank of England is the monetary policy authority.
And let's be clear,
by the way, I believe
it also has statutory duty to control inflation. So I think you and I again agree that when it comes to making a judgment about who's responsible for inflation going up or coming down, it has to be the independent central bank. But there is a second, because I just want to wrap up this section about this particular period of markets turmoil that unfortunately, had these massive political effects. The Bank of England put in place this rescue program. It committed $65 billion to buying government bonds to stabilise the bond market after the mini-budget. And it set a deadline.
This is after it had announced selling government bonds a few days before.
We have made this point already, so we don't have to make it again. And they set a deadline of October the 14th, a Friday, for ending this support, right? You were given advice by senior officials that in order to stabilise the government bond market, in order to bring the cost of borrowing down for the government, the first thing you had to do was sack your Chancellor, put in a new Chancellor, and reverse much that was in the mini budget. Do you ever think to yourself that that was the wrong advice and you should have toughed it out? This was Simon Case, I think, who was saying this to you, the Cabinet Secretary.
And I received a letter saying that as well.
A formal letter from the Cabinet Secretary. Saying,
which is quite serious.
It's very serious. So he wrote a formal letter saying, we're going to hell in a handcart. You won't be able to borrow if you don't sack your Chancellor and reverse the mini-budget.
It was the pressure on me was to reverse the mini-budget.
So nobody said you got to sack Kwasi, but they said you have to reverse the mini-budget.
The events of that week were... On Monday morning, one of the newspapers had a front-page splash that I was going to be forced to reverse corporation tax. And this is the type of thing that went on, is the media were briefed and they were leaked to force me to reverse the policy. And this is by people who were allegedly working, or they were meant to be working in the government, but they were clearly not working for the Prime Minister or the Chancellor, which is, I think, we've got a major...
And do you think these were Whitehall officials doing the leaking?
Well,
do you think these were your political colleagues?
Well, I hadn't seen the OBR forecast myself, so I don't know how other people would have got hold of that.
So what was leaked was the OBR was saying that the deficit was even bigger than the Treasury thought.
Which the figures turned out to be completely wrong, and. By the autumn budget, the figures were much lower.
But anyway, the point is the leak of the £70 billion the £70 billion OBR calculation for what the deficit would be, that massively upset investors. It did, as you say, spook markets.
Yeah, and that was, in my view, and I don't know who was running this, but that was a concerted campaign to force me to change policy, and. Kwasi by then had gone to the IMF in Washington, so he wasn't in the country. You've got to remember here that I was the Prime Minister, not the Chancellor. So I had an overview of what was going on, but it was Kwasi Kwarteng who was doing all the detailed work. Of course, I was there, discussing it. We were agreeing on the plans, but really he was the one having the discussions with the Bank of England, with the Treasury officials, making sure everything was fine beforehand. But what happened when he went to the IMF is that I ended up being the one everything was presented to. And I was under huge pressure from everybody in the building pretty much to reverse those policies. And, I believed it was the wrong thing to reverse those policies, that it would make Britain worse off. But when it got to the point where people said it would cause a debt crisis, and we didn't know what was going to happen on the Monday cliff edge.
And can I just be clear? Simon Case wrote you a formal letter saying, as head of the civil service, his view was that if you don't reverse the mini budget, you will be unable to borrow.
That's what he was hearing from the Bank of England.
So he said in his letter, I am being told by the Bank of England
Correct.
that if you do not reverse the mini budget, the government will not be able to borrow next week.
Pretty much. I mean, I can't remember the exact wording, but
that was the gist of it.
That was the gist.
And as you say, it is impossible for a prime minister to ignore.
I mean, I could not ignore that letter,
But do you think it was true?
I am
do you think that, because that is an amazingly shocking thing for a cabinet secretary to tell a prime minister. Was he telling the truth?
Well, let's just go back to what had happened before. So prior to the mini budget, when we'd spent weeks preparing the mini budget with Treasury officials, people thought it could create, they'd got an estimate of what the market impact would be, but it was all within reasonable bounds. So we felt reassured to go ahead with the mini budget. We didn't know anything about the LDI crisis. So given that I had been blown out of the water on the Monday following the mini budget, thinking the mini budget had gone well, thinking that the reaction was, pretty much as suspected, and then the following Monday being absolutely shocked that the markets had gone wild as a result of the LDI issue, when I was presented with that information from senior officials, I was not going to put, the country's ability to fund its own spending at risk. I was not going to do that, Robert. I had to.
No, of course not. I mean, no.
But you say, of course not. But there are some people who say you should have stood firm and not resiled from the corporation tax.
It's too big a risk.
But it was, I couldn't.
No.
And, by that stage, I knew deep down that, probably my days were numbered. But what I had to do was make sure that, the country wasn't plunged into a crisis. That was my duty.
No, of course it was your duty. I just was wondering, now that you've had more time to reflect on this, whether there was another route you could have taken at that stage, only because
I literally tried. I thought about everything.
Right.
I thought about everything. I mean, the problem was, by that stage, the political atmosphere was febrile, the market atmosphere was febrile. It was clear to the world that the economic institutions did not back my economic policy. So that was a very difficult position to be in. And ultimately, I had to throw the kitchen sink at making sure that we didn't end up in a worse position, which is why I regrettably had to sack Kwasi, which I didn't want to do. But I thought if I, there needed to be somebody who could front up the new set of policies, which essentially were the policies of the economic establishment.
But
they'd got their own way.
But you must have been aware that for a prime minister to sack a chancellor so soon after taking office, and in a Tory party that had had recent history of regicide, of throwing out a prime minister, that you were probably signing your own death warrant.
Well, probably.
Did you think about that at the time, that if you sacked Kwasi, you were almost certainly on your way out yourself?
I probably knew that, but I was more concerned with the bottom not falling out of the government's being able to finance itself. I mean, that was I'd moved into, it was very serious. I'd moved into damage limitation mode.
I can't
I was
imagine the stress you must have been feeling at the time, because I mean, this is an enormous weight of responsibility on your shoulders at that point.
and the whole frustration here is that, I did not feel that I had the levers to actually exercise the responsibility, that I was being blamed for a crisis that was largely of somebody else's making. But, politics is what it is. And,
Well, I think most people would say there's a bit of shared responsibility here. But I do want to then come back to those last days. And you chose Jeremy Hunt.
I think it's worth, just on this shared responsibility issue. I mean, one of the things that I write about in my book, 10 Years to Save the West, which I believe you very kindly read, Robert.
I have read it. It's a gripping read.
It's a gripping read. There we are. Robert Pesser's gripping read. The sort of oversight of the economy in Britain has become very balkanised. So, you have the Bank of England with these responsibilities. It's become clear to me that the Bank of England wasn't even communicating within itself, let alone with the Treasury. You've got the OBR forecasting system, which acts independently of the Treasury and essentially presents the Chancellor with his pocket money every 2 weeks during a fiscal event. You've got the different regulatory authorities, and there has become this doctrine in the Treasury that the Chancellor doesn't really question monetary policy at all. So, I was sitting there as Prime Minister with a clear set of economic policies, with a Chancellor with a clear set of economic policies that really we weren't able to fully enact. And this is why, I'm prepared to take responsibility for things that I know about and I have a decision-making power over, but that is not the case. And the problem...
But you're not very good, let's be clear, you're not very good at wooing people. In fact, you do the opposite. I mean,
this is not a dating show. It's
not a dating bit, but you don't have to sack the head of the Treasury the moment you come in. You don't have to, you say the establishment is against you, and, maybe the establishment, frankly, was always going to be wary of the kind of things that you wanted to do, but you didn't exactly help your cause by, getting rid of, in a sense, this sort of symbol of that establishment. Well, obviously, at that point, the others around are going to say, this person is just out to get us. What shouldn't you at least be trying to persuade people of your point of view rather than just pushing them out the door, ignoring the OBR and all the rest of it?
We didn't ignore the OBR. The OBR were not asked for a forecast.
Well, that's ignoring
on any of the furlough announcements. Well, which were bigger than the mini budget. So there's a lot of selective...
But arguably, in the case of the furlough announcements, we were in the middle of an absolute national crisis. People would say the crisis we were in as a result of you was one you created, and you could have avoided it if you'd done a bit more wooing of the so-called establishment rather than alienating them. Well,
I think it's absolutely right that a Chancellor should be able to choose the permanent secretary working for him. And I think most people in Britain will be astonished to know that isn't the case. And the fact that there was such a furore about that shows to me that permanent officials in the government have too much power. That's what it shows to me. I think it's a completely reasonable thing to say, I'm a new Chancellor. I want to work with a permanent secretary who understands my philosophy, wants to implement it. I think that's perfectly reasonable. I think we've got a problem in Britain if it's not the politicians who are democratically accountable who can actually change things.
Can I just ask, even with the benefit of hindsight, you still don't think it would have been better to engage in a bit more persuasion and a little less steamrollering?
Well, look, I've been a government minister for 10 years. So I've spent a lot of time using both tactics, could I say. And, I've got a lot of things done. Whether it's the trade deals I did at Trade, whether it's the Ukraine support and sanctions I did at the Foreign Office, getting Nazanin out of jail, which was no no mean feat. So I'm capable of both of those strategies. And it was the judgment at the time. I mean, I have to say, the way the economic establishment reacted to trying to change things shows to me that they have become extremely powerful. And lots of people say that what we did has empowered them and the OBR is more powerful than ever. But to me, it shows the fact that things haven't really changed very much in economic policy for the last 20 years because we have such powerful economic institutions. And I do think that is not very democratic.
Now, you chose as Chancellor, your second Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, who is sort of the political antithesis of you. He, in your terms, has very much pursued what you would call the establishment agenda of, for example, I think in your view, not, for example, trying to cut taxes fast enough, not pushing through the kind of radical supply side changes that you want to see fast enough. Why did you choose him?
Well, I chose him for that reason.
Was he your first choice?
Yes. I chose him because I needed somebody who could stabilise the situation, who people knew. I mean, by that stage, frankly, I could see the battle was lost in order to make these changes. My whole strategy and quasi-strategy had been to try and take the action early on all fronts, on the supply side, on the public spending, on the tax reductions, to change Britain's economic trajectory. And we had to do that quickly. Otherwise, we wouldn't see things start to improve quickly enough. That was absolutely key. As I've said, we developed our policies with Treasury officials, and I don't believe there's any one person at the Treasury that can do things. There are plenty of good officials at Treasury. We developed our policies, but our plan was undermined by, in my view, in large part. I'm not saying I'm perfect, Robert. I'm not saying that at all.
Good God.
But I'm saying in large part it was undermined by, the very actors we were concerned about in the first place. And, so I felt that the opportunity to do that had been lost. Of course, I'm a patriot. I did not want the country not to be able to fund its debt. I didn't want us to be in that situation. So I brought, I've worked with Jeremy Hunt before. I brought in the person that I thought would reassure the establishment. That's
now if, like me, you think it's an absolute priority to get the UK out of this period of stagnation, the thing that you would criticize you for is this, and this would be true whether you're on the left or whether you're on the right, and it would be that you have made a whole generation of politicians just way too risk averse. Because if you look at the current debate between your party, led by Rishi Sunak, and the Labour Party, led by Keir Starmer, arguably they're just arguing about marginal differences of tax, of economic policy, and the thing that they're terrified of is being seen to increase borrowing in a way that could spook the market. And that boxes people in a way that means that it's even harder than it was to get the kind of economic policy changes, as I say, either from a left perspective or a right perspective, that might get a sense of hope back into the British people that their lives are going to be better. Will you accept responsibility that you had this big opportunity and you blew it?
Well, you won't be surprised to hear I don't agree with you about what you just said. Nick, to my mind, there has been an economic consensus in this country since the late 90s. And, at the turn of the century, the UK's, we spent 36% of GDP on the government. We now spend 45% of GDP on the government. Our taxes are a record high. We've become more heavily regulated. Our energy costs have become more expensive. Our planning systems become even more Byzantine, if that were possible. And I think we are in a similar period to the period we were of the previous economic consensus under the likes of Macmillan, Ted Heath, Harold Wilson. And I was trying to break out of that consensus. So it wasn't like politicians before me had done radical supply side reforms and tax cuts and slimmed the size.
Margaret Thatcher certainly had.
No, I'm saying since the late 90s. That's the timeline I'm talking about. But you're saying that politicians are more risk averse. I think politicians have been risk averse for some time, and not just.
But I think there had been a growing mood around the place that we needed to make radical changes.
You obviously haven't been in the House of Commons recently, if you think that.
Okay,
but I mean that's not true, Robert.
No, but people became even more risk averse after your 49-50
I think
days.
they were pretty risk averse already, but I think more to the point, which is the point I make in the book, the institutions, the unelected bureaucrats in Britain have got more and more powerful and more difficult to take on. And I'm not just talking about the economic institutions. I'm also talking about the way the judiciary was empowered under Tony Blair by the abolition of the traditional role of the Lord Chancellor. I'm talking about the empowerment of lawyers in the system, and you can see this in the difficulty of delivering our migration policy, and the empowerment of other, unelected institutions, the Climate Change Committee being another good example. So what I'm saying is that power has been outsourced from politicians to unelected bureaucrats, and that has limited politicians' room for maneuver. Now, I tried to break out of that, and I bear the scars of trying to break out of that. But that doesn't mean that everybody before me was, I think if you look at the fact that we haven't got the EU laws off our statute books, why is that? The Conservative Parliamentary Party wants to do that. So why hasn't it happened? I think people aren't asking deep enough questions about the way Britain is governed, Robert.
Okay, but they're focusing on very superficial issues. It's all very well. Look, it may be the case that an aversion to radical change in some parts of Whitehall, that may be the case,
and the media,
but there may
also, the media,
and
the corporate sector.
All of this,
and anywhere within the M25.
Okay, but let's be absolutely clear. However, I don't think we could argue that we are living through, this era of giants when it comes to people elected to the House of Commons. You're basically saying, it is astonishing to me that you could have a decision to leave the European Union and yet have so little ability to execute a coherent plan subsequently. And in the end, surely the big responsibility for that failure to reconfigure the United Kingdom for a world outside the EU has to rest with our elected politicians who argued for it. You can't just go around saying it's not, as it happens, you were a Remainer, you didn't want Brexit, but you've now taken it up as something that you believe in. But, the reality is we had a Prime Minister in Boris Johnson who was right at the forefront of the Brexit campaign. Where was the coherent programme to make a success of Brexit? It just wasn't there. You can't blame the civil service for this. This was a failure of politicians, of political leaders.
But I do think the fact that so much power has been outsourced to unelected agencies and bureaucrats makes politics a less attractive career. Because frankly, why become an MP if you can become somebody with power who's highly paid and who's less accountable? Because MPs get a hell of a lot of abuse and flack, quite often for things that aren't our responsibility. Sometimes it is our responsibility. But I think that this is one of the key points I'm making, that since particularly since Blair, this power has been outsourced to so-called independent institutions, and it's made politics a less attractive arena for people to go into. Plus, you've had the advent of social media, 24-hour broadcast, which puts increasing pressure on politicians. I think that's a problem for Britain, because I actually want to see really high-quality people go into politics. So I think one of the things about restoring proper democratic accountability in Britain is about increasing the talent pool in politics. So I agree with you. I agree with you on that front.
And how much more do we have to pay MPs?
It's not like, I think, we could improve MPs' pay, but I think it's about more than that. It's about the power properly lying with Parliament. It's about the responsibility being aligned with the power. I think these are very important questions we need to address. And what my book talks about is, I was a minister for 10 years in education, justice, the environment, trade, the Foreign Office. And I saw this in every single area of government I worked in, is the frustration of not really being able to get things done, and everything, even minor things, being a major battle. And that shouldn't be the case with a government with a clear agenda. Now, I think you can fairly critique the Conservatives since 2010 for not reversing enough of the Blairite reforms, for not recognising the changes those had wrought, and for not recognising that a lot of power had been outsourced and we should have taken on earlier. And I think Conservatives are increasingly noticing this and noticing why it's difficult to deliver things in government. But I do think there needs to be a different settlement, because the current system is not working.
Now, in this, we haven't got an enormous amount of time. In this podcast, we also like to, get to know the people we're talking to a little bit. So I want to take you back just briefly to the younger Liz Truss. You're at school. You're a comprehensive in Leeds. Did you think then politics was going to be your life?
I didn't know. I was interested in politics. I've always been an agitator. So I was one of those kids that was always arguing with the teachers and putting my point of view across. So
very annoying young person.
I was very annoying. Some of my teachers loved me and some of my teachers hated me.
But at what point did it feel to you this was going to be your life?
I don't know. Probably I'd always, I was involved in student politics. I'd always kind of hankered after it. But when I think after university, I got a job for Shell, so I worked in the oil industry. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed commercial work. I love doing deals. That's one thing I love. But there was always something just a bit missing, the sort of purpose. So it was the purpose and the ability to change things was why I went into politics.
And you started as a Lib Dem. At what point did you discover you weren't a Lib Dem?
It was, I think, studying economics was the penny drop moment for me, because I always believed in freedom. I always believed that people are best making their own decisions and the government shouldn't be doing that. But it was when I studied economics and understood economic freedom that I joined the Hayek Society at Oxford.
What did your dad say? Because your dad is not on that side of politics.
He's not.
When you joined the Hayek Society, what on earth did your dad say to you?
I don't think he knows about that. He doesn't know about that.
Oh, he still has. This is the first time he's learned. But... Fascinating. Then, I mean, I want you to sort of tell us in the end what your sort of overall sort of emotional reflections are on your period as Prime Minister. But if you look at your period in government, what was the most fulfilling? What was the sort of high point? And what was the low point?
I mean, the high point was genuinely the day of the mini-budget. When I thought that we had been able to deliver this package that was actually going to improve lives in Britain. And, for years and years, Kwasi and I have been talking about it. Things like, corporation tax, planning reform, doing all these things and getting frustrated, frankly, that it wasn't happening. that the Treasury just seemed to keep finding new ways of raising taxes, and that, regulation was just getting more and more stringent. And even though we'd left the EU, we hadn't really taken advantage of those freedoms. So that was the moment for me that I thought, yes, this is actually moving in the right direction.
And the low point presumably is, if you're using that as the high point, the low point is presumably what, the day that you stood outside Number 10 and had to say goodbye, I assume.
I mean, I think the low point was actually when, that week where I had to reverse the corporation tax decision, because that's when I knew it was, the policy was dead. That's when I knew it was dead.
And this was intense and intense. I mean, you had the death of the monarch. You had this financial crisis. You had to sack as Chancellor somebody you were pretty close to politically and as a friend. This was a really traumatic period. Probably more traumatic than pretty much any modern prime minister has had to endure. Although I would imagine the trauma for Boris Johnson of not only having to manage COVID but getting ill with COVID.
Die.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Die.
I mean, I don't want to.
I
certainly don't want to underrate.
So.
I don't want to underrate the trauma that you went through, given, as I say, both managing a country through that kind of crisis and then getting, as you say, getting acutely ill was awful. But you faced enormous amounts of personal criticism. I've said this to you before. Your resilience is remarkable. I mean, quite a lot of people after that would have just, run away and hidden. But that's plainly not in your character.
No.
And it is quite remarkable. Was there ever a moment when you thought about running away?
Not seriously, no.
And so where does your strength come from?
Well, I am motivated by wanting things to change. And, I always knew it'd be difficult. This is when I put myself forward for the leadership election, I thought it was going to be unpleasant. I didn't want to, I wasn't sort of compelled to do it because I wanted the job as Prime Minister. I felt, this is what I was in politics to do. So I just have a very strong sense of purpose, I guess, is the way I would put it.
Come on, it's more than purpose. There is something that you either got from your parents or is genetic. There is something else there. What is it?
It's hard to analyze yourself, isn't it? Because I just, I just think, from now, what have I learned from my time in Number 10 and my time as a minister? And how can I use that knowledge to, help other Conservatives and advance the causes we believe in? And
so what's the future for Liz Truss then?
I think, first of all, Conservatives need to understand that we haven't been winning the arguments. And this is not just true in Britain, it's true in the United States, it's true across the free world, that things have moved to the left, that the establishment has moved to the left. So whereas people were monetarists, they're now Keynesians. Whereas, people believed in a free market economy, there's now more calls for government intervention. So, and, in the social space, we've had gender ideology, anti-colonialism, all of these ologies have sort of gone up the agenda and political salience. So, I want to learn from what's happened to make the Conservative case, but also, and what I fundamentally believe that requires is changing our institutions. I think that's that's the biggest thing I've learnt, is just how powerful they are.
And what about changing the Conservative Party, though? You are a very broad coalition. It's proved very difficult in recent times to hold that coalition together. If you lose the election, and that's what the polls say, presumably you're going to be leading a battle for the identity of your party, aren't you?
Well, I think that, there is a live discussion about what the Conservative Party should do. And there are some people in the Conservative Party who say we should accept that, the institutions have moved to the left, that we are living in a big government country, and that's just the way things are. I think also the Conservatives' electoral coalition has changed. So I think the red wall is a permanent fixture now of what it is to be a Conservative. So yes, there are some very big debates going on about the future of the party, and I want to be part of that.
I mean, it's a coalition. Do you think, in order for the Conservative Party to rebuild, it's frankly got to split first?
I just think we need to be adhering to core Conservative principles. Beliefs in freedom, free markets and free enterprise, a sovereign nation state. These are core Conservative beliefs, but I very strongly objected to smoking legislation, for example, banning adults from smoking. I think that's not Conservative. So yes, we are having these very live debates in the party about what being a Conservative is.
And for Liz Truss personally, you're going to fight the next election.
Yes.
Could you envisage ever doing anything else other than being an MP?
Not gonna. Well, I'm not ruling anything out. I'm not ruling anything out.
But do you fancy doing anything else? I just want to know what apart from being an MP.
I love being an MP. I think politics is where it's at, and I want people in Britain to be more involved in politics, to care more about politics. I want to see more people want to run for office. I think we need big changes in this country, and the only place that can ultimately come from, the only people who can change the law, are MPs.
And David Cameron suffered the humiliation of losing the Brexit vote. He's back as Foreign Secretary. Could you see yourself back in government one day, personally?
I'm not hankering after that. I really am not. I want to. I want Conservative leadership in the world again. It's very important to me what happens in the United States. I think that's absolutely crucial.
Some people would say that your admiration for Trump is just weird because so many of his values are not yours. I mean, you believe in democracy. It's not obvious that he believes in democracy.
Well, he does believe in democracy.
Well, I think.
So anyway, you have to interview him.
I think January the 6th is really quite a big counter argument.
I'm very clear that Biden won the 2020 election.
And he is not clear about that. Let's be clear.
Well, I'm not saying I agree with every single Trump statement, but what I do think is that America needs serious change.
And you think that the kind of change that Trump would push is the kind of change that would be good for this country?
Well, if you look at what he did, cutting taxes, cutting regulations, very sort of pro-free market, it's exactly the kind of thing we need here. Fracking, supporting cheap energy.
Liz Truss, the Trumpian.
I thought you were going to go off on fracking again, Robert.
No. We've had that conversation. We've had that disagreement. So look, as ever, great to see you, and I'm sure we'll be talking again at length before too long. Liz Truss, thank you so much.
Good to see you.